Now that Commerce Department put more restrictions on technology trade and prohibits U.S. companies from selling to China, what does the U.S. industry think of such intervention?
Now, there's been a lot of calls in the US Congress, for example, for putting further restrictions on those electronic design automation tools. Typically, those have not been subject to export controls, for example. So what's been subject to export controls? And so the entity list is just one piece of the export control system. So the other piece is sort of specific technologies. So for example, all the technology that goes into one of the most advanced parts of semiconductor manufacturing, so-called extreme ultraviolet lithography. And these are very complicated, $150 million to $500 million pieces of equipment that you need to do that manufacturing at the most advanced nodes. And the US government has put pressure on the Dutch government to not issue a license to ship that equipment to SMIC. So in general, I think the export control actions on the part of the US government and other things like disapproving sort of companies in Europe from providing certain kinds of equipment to certain companies has also sort of disrupted a little bit that sector, right? Because normally ASML would probably sell a lot of EUV equipment to Chinese companies, not just SMIC, but other companies in China. And then recently, for example, another foreign company, which makes memories semiconductors, wanted to put that equipment into its facility in Wuxi, where it's manufacturing memory, and it wants to keep up with the competition, which and other companies are using EUV in memory to make more advanced semiconducttors. But the U.S. government basically vetoed that transfer of EUV equipment, which is arguably just within the company. It's not really it's not in a sense an export to China, to a Chinese company, but even that was considered to be of concern because that EUV technology is so advanced and it's controlled within the U.S. export control system and with the sort of multilateral export control system under what's called the Wassenaar Agreement, which is sort of a voluntary agreement. The Netherlands is a member and the Dutch government would honor that restriction that if the U.S. government pushed that on that EUV equipment. So export control intervention here is not just the entity list, which is a sort of end user based restriction, but it's more on it also includes technology. Now, SMIC was also added to the entity list last year with very specific language, which said U.S. companies could not ship equipment that was inherently designed for below 10 nanometer. That was a very unusual entity list action taken by the Commerce Department to specify equipment of a certain type. And in this case, it caused confusion because usually equipment isn't designed for a specific node, for example, and because the equipment that's being used now, for example, at SMIC, dense ultraviolet lithography, that can go down in some cases to 7 nanometers, depending on how you use it for certain kinds of production, certain kinds of layers in the semiconductor. And so there's been a lot of debate about, how should that be interpreted by U.S. industry? So the biggest effect of all these really, it's on both the Chinese companies that are affected, but also on U.S. companies, right? Because U.S. companies that dominate these sectors are losing a lot of revenue if they're cut off from the China market. And their argument and the U.S. industry argument is, that this is a national security concern because China is such a big market for some of these things. And particularly Huawei, for example, was a huge buyer of U.S. semiconductors. The argument is that, U.S. companies benefit from that in terms of plowing a lot of that profit back into R&D and allowing them to continue to innovate and continuing to lead in their respective sectors and continue to design advanced semiconductors, some of which are used by the U.S. government. So the argument that the U.S. companies have made is interventions in this industry of this type have to be done very carefully because they could have these unexpected negative consequences of sort of undercutting the innovation capability of leading U.S. companies, particularly in the semiconductor equipment sector. Companies like Applied Materials, Lam Research, KLA Tencor. These are companies that really are world leaders and dominate these sectors. And Japanese companies like Tokyo Electron are also big players in that. And then, of course, ASML in Europe. But these companies are used to selling, fairly freely into different markets and to different companies. To the extent you're starting to cut off those types of sales, the argument is the consequences should be carefully thought through before the U.S. government makes these decisions. And clearly, in the case of, for example, Huawei, there didn't seem to be a whole lot of thought that went into that action. Again, no clear guidance given to BIS and how to license, for example. And so, that's an example of a policy that may have not been very well thought through and had sort of unintended collateral damage to the global supply chain of semiconductors, right? And that's sort of the industry argument is interventions here should be done very carefully.